Most of us grew up, and most people grow up wanting to get married at some point. Maybe different ages, different cultures. The average married age or marriage age is different depending on where you live. Even in this country, depending on where you live, it's going to be very different from where we come from. I guess probably the average age is quite a bit younger, honestly, than other places, even just a few hours up the interstate. In other countries, it's even more different, but marriage in general is a custom and a desire for most people. A girl might have her wedding planned before she even has a boyfriend. I guess a guy could too, although that would be a little weird, but possible. Most people, whether they're like that or not, they do want to get married at some point. And the subject of marriage and divorce is a difficult one, especially today. I think it probably was always, as we're going to see from our text, but especially so in our culture, in our day, because a culture and society where marriage is degraded, for lack of a better word, downplayed or disregarded, the sanctity of it causes a lot of marital issues. So it's a tough subject. There are many broken homes, far more than used to be the case in our country. And our text today is going to impact about maybe half of us in one way, maybe the other half in another way. And our job, my job specifically, I guess in this case, is to be sensitive to the subject, but also to teach the truth, which is really the job anytime. I am aware of the sensitivity of it, the delicacy of it, but I'm also aware of what Jesus says about it, and that's what needs to be said. So we can do it the way Jesus did it and tell the truth in a way that is helpful and not altogether unprofitable, although for some people it was unprofitable. And like I said, the reason this subject is so important is because we need to understand God's expectations about marriage. Everybody does, because marriage is important. It's not some custom that man made up that can be thrown away, or it's not an outdated idea that goes against human nature. You may have heard that accusation before, that marriage goes against human monogamy. Man is not meant to be monogamous. It's against nature and all that nonsense. We need to understand what God expects about marriage, what He says about marriage, because He's a pretty important character when it comes to marriage, as we're going to see. Undermine is probably the word I was looking for earlier. A lot of people today undermine marriage and cheapen it, try to redefine it. But as our lesson suggests, at least the outline, nowhere in Scripture is God more clear about His expectations for marriage than right here. So that's where we're going to be. I hope that's where your Bible's open. If you have a finger on Mark 10, that could be helpful too, although we're going to use Matthew primarily. We got to remember very quickly, first of all, where Jesus is. We're studying the life of Christ, so we have to maybe refresh our minds about what's going on. He was on His way to Jerusalem. Our part here, the lesson, part 9, is the Perean ministry, but then He's going back to Jerusalem, and now that Perean ministry has come to an end pretty much, and now he is on His way to Jerusalem. His final week was approaching. The Passover was very near. In fact, chapter 18, Matthew 18 marks, the very beginning of chapter 19 marks the end of the fourth teaching section of Matthew. If you remember, we made a pointed out that Matthew seems to be divided into teaching sections and then application sections, or these different groups of teachings. And Matthew 19, they're almost always marked by the phrase, when Jesus finished these sayings. So whenever you see that phrase in Matthew, that is Matthew telling you that another section is ended, and now he's starting a new phase, a new section. So we see that in Matthew 19, verse 1. If you're interested, as I flip backwards here, the first one is chapter 7, verse 28, after the Sermon on the Mount. The second one is then, they're usually grouped in a few chapters each. Chapter 11, verse 1. Then we have another one in, lost it. Number 3. Chapter 13, verse 53. And then the fourth one is ended right here in Matthew 19, verse 1. When Jesus finished these sayings. So let's look at the text. See what this account has to say. Matthew 19, we'll read first. We'll just read through verse 9. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered. In fact, we'll just stop right there at verse 3 to start us off here. This is setting the stage. Jesus finished. One little aspect I've forgot to mention is that Jesus somehow wound up back in between Samaria and Galilee, as we saw, I guess, Wednesday night. So he was in Perea, which was to the east of Judea. Then he went back up north towards Galilee. Now he's heading back down to Judea. And he was healing people. Many crowds were following him, it says. Large crowds followed him as he went from a little around Galilee down to Judea. And he was healing people. But then the Pharisees came up. Surprise, surprise. Right? Who would have thought? And they had a test for him. They were going to test him. And here's how they tested him. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Why was this a test? Why would this be? How could this be testing Jesus? It's a yes or no question. How is this a test?
Because Moses allowed it.
Okay. Moses, they said, allowed. This is where Mark's account comes a little bit in handy, because in verse 4, they go on and say, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away, which they say a similar thing in Matthew's account. It's just in question form. So they say, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. So what do you say? Is basically what they're asking. How is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? It was a test because here's what Moses said. But there was also some other characters that had things to say on this. This was a hot button issue at this time. Over generations and over time, issues are more emphasized than other issues. Some issues are emphasized. So you go back a few decades in our society, in our culture, a certain issue was going to be more of a serious issue, talked about a lot, than it is today. And you go back another few decades, it'll be a different issue. And that's just how it evolves over time. Well, at this time in Jesus' day, among the Jews, this was one of the hottest issues. So it was controversial to put Jesus, they were putting him in a difficult situation like they tried to do all the time. There were other ideas among the Jews. Now, Moses said one thing, but there was also the two leading rabbis of the time, at least on this subject. You may have heard their names before. One is named Shammai, Rabbi Shammai, and Rabbi Hillel. Now, Shammai was the conservative, for lack of a better word, I'll call him conservative and liberal. The school of Shammai was the conservative standpoint, the more strict standpoint. Whereas Hillel was the more liberal. Basically said a man could divorce his wife for literally any cause whatsoever. So not only are they putting Jesus against Moses, but also he's going to, by his answer, they're expecting him to also, put himself in the camp of one of these two, which will also divide. That's going to cause division, and also because what if there are some people that follow Jesus from the school that agree with Shammai, but then there's a group of people that follow Jesus that follow Hillel on this, agree with him, and Jesus attaches himself to one of them, then that'll at least be a small victory for the Pharisees. But their biggest idea is to pit him against Moses. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Jesus responded perfectly, as he always did. Mark's account says, what did Moses say? Excellent question. Because he probably knew that there was that Shammai and Hillel stuff, underneath the surface, the elephant in the room. He just puts it straight to Moses, first of all. What did Moses say? Matthew's account in verse 4 says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. That was Jesus' response. If we might paraphrase what Jesus said, it's a yes or no question. He answered the yes or no question. He just answered it in a lot more words than yes or no. But his answer, if we want to be technical, is not exactly. That might be the way I would. I was going to just say no, but then I thought, well, he doesn't exactly say no because Jesus understands it's a trick question. Not exactly. It's not that simple. But here's the important thing about what Jesus did, and we'll see this later on this morning. He went straight to the Scriptures. He went far beyond the law of Moses. Now, he quotes Moses. He's quoting Moses, isn't he? Because Moses wrote Genesis. But he's not, whenever they're talking about Moses, they're talking about the law of Moses. So he goes way beyond the law of Moses, and he goes to the beginning. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Moses was ever even born. And he says this is the way it was when? From the beginning, at the beginning, God created male and female and intended that they should leave father and mother. Of course, Adam and Eve didn't leave father and mother because they didn't have one. But from that point on, leaving father and mother and cleaving to one another, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. So that answers their question by saying they're one, and what God has joined together, man should not separate. So basically, marriage is intended to be for life. One flesh. You can't tear apart one flesh without doing extreme harm. It's going to harm, create a lot of damage. But then they were going to offer a rebuttal to that. And I'll give them credit. It's the correct response. It's the best response they could have had. even though they're still trying to trap him, but at least the question itself was a really good question based on Jesus' answer. Why then did Moses command one to give her certificate of divorce and to send her away? And by the way, that implies that Jesus' answer is sort of no, even though Moses allowed it. So that's why they asked. So why did Moses say that a man could give a certificate of divorce and send his wife away if he wanted, if what you say is true? In other words, if God intended marriage to be permanent, then why did Moses write what he wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 24? Deuteronomy chapter 24 says this, first 4 verses anyway. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, she departs from his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her, got a lot of additional conditions going on here, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she's been defiled, for that's an abomination before Jehovah. You shall not bring sin upon the land that Jehovah your God is giving you for an inheritance. Now there's a lot of ifs and ifs and ifs and ifs and ifs, and it sounds like a legal contract. But notice the emphasis in this case is a man, if he finds some indecency in his wife, can write her a certificate of divorce and send her away. That's the short version. Now that obviously is going to open up the question of what is an indecency, and things like this. Some indecency, and we know, as we've seen and talked about with the Jews and the rabbis and the scribes and how they did things, there are probably volumes upon volumes written about what an indecency is, just like there is volumes and volumes about what a work is on the Sabbath day. This is a work, this is not a work. This is a work, this is not a work. This is an indecency that warrants divorce by certificate. This is not. I guess Hillel wouldn't have had anything on this not list because to him and his followers, anything counts. Whereas Shammai, ironically, said everything is on the not list except for one thing. ... So, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce? Jesus answers and he says, here's why. And by the way, I found it a little strange, the statement that's made in our lesson text that says, we don't really know why Moses allowed divorce under the Old Covenant. That shocked me because Jesus in this exact text says exactly the reason why it was allowed in the Old Testament. We do know exactly why God, or in their minds, Moses, allowed this stipulation or this exception or whatever. Because of your hardness of heart, Jesus says. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to do this, to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. Now he's elaborated on his answer. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Well, in so many words, he says, God doesn't really want that. So why did Moses say they could? Because of your hard hearts. But from the beginning, it wasn't that way. It's almost as if they had forgotten that there was a very long period of time between creation and the law of Moses at Sinai. And the law of Moses did not exist before that time. So, as long as the law of Moses, from the instatement of the law of Moses to this conversation was about the same amount of time, if not less time, than it was between the law of Moses being instated and creation. Very long time. And yet, it's like they totally disregarded that as even a fact. So Jesus takes them way before the law of Moses, just like it was pointed out with circumcision. Moses commanded circumcision. No, actually, circumcision was commanded by God way before Moses. That covenant was given to Abraham. It didn't start with Moses. So that whether Moses commanded it or not is irrelevant. It went beyond Moses. Well, God's expectations and desire for marriage also goes far beyond Moses. And that's what Jesus does. He just leapfrogs Moses, and he goes straight to creation, back to the very beginning. And the rule of thumb with principles, and whether they're cultural or timeless, is always, if it goes back to creation, it's not cultural. If something goes back to creation, it can't be a cultural phenomenon, because how would that even work? If Paul uses creation or some event around the creation to ground a principle that he's teaching, like male leadership in the church, which he does, by the way, can't say it's cultural, because that culture, Paul's culture, was far removed from creation culture than our culture is from Paul's culture. So it has nothing to do with culture and changing with the times. Marriage is the same way. God's desire for marriage has nothing to do with Moses, because from the beginning, it wasn't the way that he allowed in the law of Moses. From the beginning, it was different. And namely, he didn't want people to get divorced. But he allowed it. Remember what Paul said in Acts 17 about there was a time when God overlooked, or you may have heard it quoted from the old King James, that he winked at some things, but not anymore. Well, in the law of Moses, God allowed divorce because of the hardness of heart of the people that were under that law. So it's not a compliment. It's not a merciful thing. It's not like, well, I guess in a way it is, but it's not like, I like you so much. I don't like divorce, but I love you so much, I'm going to go ahead and let you do it anyway, if you want. No, Jesus is saying the reason that it was allowed, it was put into the law of Moses, is because you people wouldn't be able to handle it otherwise. God knew that you wouldn't be able to handle what He really wanted for marriage. You're not good enough. Spiritually. Morally, even. Your hard hearts caused God to put that exception in there, or Moses. Even Jesus says Moses did it. So, from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, verse 9, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. This is the key verse. He's not saying that's what Moses said, but I'm going to contradict Moses and give this. It's not about Moses. The only reason Jesus mentions Moses is because they did. He's talking about whether it's lawful overall, in general, pleasing in God's eyes. You see, this was something that was about to change with the changing of the law. The law was soon to be changed. So whether it's lawful under the law of Moses is very soon to be irrelevant. And he takes them to school, but not the school of Shammai, not the school of Hillel, but the school of God. Not the school of Moses. The school of Jehovah God, the Creator. Whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and then marries another commits adultery. Now, if you remember what we just read in Deuteronomy 24 with all those additional, if this and if this and if this, the gist of that was that a man can divorce his wife, but then if somebody else takes her, and then he divorces her, the original can't take her back because it's an abomination. Well, Jesus says anybody who divorces his wife at all, except for fornication, and then goes and marries another person, that's the abomination. Not if then they divorce her and then the other one, the original one, takes her back again, it's an abomination, but it's an abomination for there to be another marriage at all. If a man marries, again, if divorces his wife except for fornication and then marries another, he commits adultery. There are two key words in this verse are fornication and the word commits. The word fornication is so important because of what it means, and more importantly, what it doesn't mean. But the word commits is important because of the tense of the word and the significance of that, the tense of that verb there. So, fornication. The Greek word is porneia, and it is the word from which we get the English word pornography, same prefix or whatever. But the word means unlawful sexual intercourse with another person, a person that's not your spouse. That's what fornication is. When a married person does it, it's called adultery. Same act, just if you're married, it's adultery. If you're not married, it's just called fornication. They're both fornication. But what man has done, ironically, just as the school of Hillel did with Deuteronomy 24, with that word indecency, at least that's the word used in the ESV. Here's a list of things that are indecent, classify as indecency. This. Well, what's fornication? And I've said it before, and I'll say it again here. I believe that sexual immorality is not a very good translation for that word, that Greek word, because it broadens the word even more than it's supposed to be broadened. Because there are many things that are sexually immoral that are not fornication. Fornication is physical sexual relations with somebody that's not your spouse, your scriptural spouse. And Jesus says, anybody who divorces his wife except for the cause of his wife having physical sexual relations with another person, and then marries another person, divorces her, and then marries again, he is committing adultery. By marrying that second person, he's committing adultery. But I thought adultery can only be committed by a married person. How can that man be committing adultery if he divorces his wife and marries another woman, which now is his wife? How can that be adultery? Because he's still married to the other woman. Well, how's he still married to the other woman? Because God joined them together. And what God has joined together, man can't separate. Now, I do think that statement that Jesus makes there is probably a reference to that statute, the principle, not the people, but it would apply to the people also. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Either way, it's a true principle. God, when two people are married to one another with His blessing, they become one flesh, and they are to remain that way for life. Jesus says they are not able to be scripturally divorced unless one of them has physical sexual relations with another person, and the person chooses to end the marriage. They could forgive them, and that would be totally acceptable. God clearly views forgiveness favorably. Now, it's not easy to do that. It would not be easy. And that's why God, in His mercy and His grace, included one exception. It's not a long list of exceptions. It's certainly not for any cause, but that exception is there. So that's Jesus' response. Very quickly, and if you have any questions, we'll save that for the end here. The disciples, that was the end of the conversation with the Pharisees. Mark includes the detail that now they went back to the house, wherever they were staying, or the place that they were staying, not back to the house, but they went into a house by some hospitable person. The disciples were very concerned and bothered by what Jesus had said. Not because it went against Moses. They didn't think it went against Moses. They were bothered by it because of how strict it sounded. Now, I say it's ironic because that happens to be exactly what the school of Shammai said about the law of Moses. Only one exception. Indecency in the school of Shammai was fornication, just like Jesus says. But he's not agreeing, he's not saying, I think Shammai is right. He's saying, I think God is right. And this is the way that it is, and it's going to be. Shammai just happened to get it right, I guess you could say. Anyway, they said, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it'd be better not to even marry. That's how they reacted to Jesus' statement. Now, there's a rule of interpretation. It's not high up on the list, but it is important. It can help us to understand some elements of something that's been said by the way the people react to it, who heard it. This is one of those examples. Anybody who says, what you're saying about this verse sounds way too strict. There's no way Jesus would expect that. There's no way God expects that. That is far too strict. That's exactly how the disciples felt. That's why they reacted that way. If what you say is true, Lord, it'd be better not to get married. Jesus said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this receive it. Not everyone can receive this saying. I think that is a reference to what they just said. What saying? No, what saying is he talking about? The saying that they just said. That is, it's better not to marry. Not everybody can do that, Jesus says. That's exactly what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7. Not everybody can do it, but only those to whom it is given. So in that situation and context, Paul was saying there's a great persecution going on, and in the light of this, being single has its benefits because your family won't be able to be used against you to renounce the Lord. It's easier to move from place to place. It's just easier if you're single. But Paul says, I understand not everybody can do that. Paul was one of those to whom that gift was given. And he says, personally, I wish you'd be like I am, but I know that not everybody can do that. And therefore, if you're not going to be able to remain pure, unmarried, you need to marry. Jesus is saying virtually the same thing. Not everyone can do that, but only those to whom it's given. But then all this eunuch talk throws a lot of people off. I'll tell you who else it threw off is one of the ancient scholars. I can't remember which one. Origen, maybe, or one of these old scholars. Misinterpreted Jesus' words here on multiple levels and decided that in light of Matthew 19:12, it would be a great thing and a good thing and a godly thing and a thing that Jesus encouraged to castrate himself. That's a pretty heavy price to pay for misinterpreting something Jesus said. But that's what he did, because he read Jesus' words saying that there are those who've made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's true, but it will fix you, being able to do some things, especially in the context of what they're talking about. I mean, one of the most, other than, burning with lust, like Paul said, procreating is one of the benefits and blessings and really exclusive things about the marriage relationship. Well, men who do that are unable to do that. So if you're unable to procreate, that would be a deal breaker in almost every other culture for marriage. Of course, back then, they wouldn't really know, and even today, most people don't know until after they're already married. But a eunuch is not going to be married, not even going to be eligible, not even going to be a candidate, even if they wanted to. I guess they could marry, but back in that culture, it's not going to happen. But Jesus' word, He's not talking about castration. He's not talking about a eunuch in that sense, but a eunuch in the sense of not marrying. As far as anything that we could apply from Jesus' words, based on their statement, be better not to marry. We have to interpret verse 12 in the light of verse 10, which is to marry or not to marry. Some people, sadly, I guess it is true, some baby boys may be made to be eunuchs in that sense from birth. The Jews circumcised their sons on the 8th day. I guess some cultures might actually castrate their sons on the 8th day or, sometime. And, that's a absolutely horrendous thing to even think about doing. But Jesus is talking about not marrying. Some people make that choice for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Paul, the apostle, was one of them. There were others. Barnabas may have been one of them. I can't remember if Paul mentions him as one of the ones who leads about a wife or one of the ones that he mentions as why shouldn't he be able to, even though he's not married. But we know Paul at least was one of those who made that choice because he had that gift. So, what about for us? Marriage is from God. It's not from man. Man was not... People say the same thing about marriage as they do about religion in general. Polytheism came first, they say. Monotheism is relatively new compared to polytheism. False. Utterly false. No leg to stand on with that argument. They say the same thing about polygamy. And not even polygamy. They would say the most natural thing is to be like the animals. Because that's what we are. Animals don't get married. There are some types of animals that seem to be monogamous to some extent. Not exactly like human marriage, but as a rule, the animal kingdom has no concern for any of that kind of thing. They just go around and procreate. Everywhere, anywhere. And the world says that's how people are, should be. And can you imagine actually believing and telling people a lot of issues in humanity would be solved if we would stop this man-made custom mess of monogamy? It's ridiculous and frankly disgusting and abominable. But that's what the world believes, or at least tries to get you to believe. But marriage is from God. He instituted it, He designed it, and we don't get to make up or change the rules.
And He knows what's best. I mean, if we actually do things, not just marriage, anything the way He wants us to, even if it is difficult, I mean, we can trust that He knows better than us.
Yeah. First, we have to believe in God in the first place. But for those who claim to believe in God, and most of the people, if not all of the people who have a problem with Matthew 19:9 are people who claim to believe in God. If they didn't, they wouldn't care what Matthew 19:9 says anyway. Those who claim to believe in God need to respect His authority in that He designed marriage and He gets to say how it is. And we don't get to change it. And it just like anything, we don't get to change it just because, well, now we're so many hundreds of years beyond that. And shouldn't we tailor it to, the situation in our country? No. All tailoring has been done. Pre-tailored. God has already tailored it, not to this culture or that culture, but to humanity, based on His will and His knowledge of knowing what's best. Secondly, marriage demands preparation. Not a wedding demands preparation. Marriage demands preparation. The preparation for a wedding is very much different than the preparation for marriage. I don't know if anybody even teaches this, or have you ever seen a class or any sort of instruction for how to prepare for marriage itself outside of, the church or, counseling sessions like that. I've seen marriage counseling, for married couples, and some who are trained in that and qualified do offer premarital counseling, which is an extremely good idea, depending on who the counselor is. A non-Christian premarital counselor is one of the worst ideas anybody could ever have to suggest for somebody to do that. The kinds of things that might be suggested, and marriage counseling that's not from a non-Christian, things that the world could suggest for how to help your marriage, you can imagine how quickly it could go off the rails. So Christian counseling, somebody who's going to be dealing under the principles of God's Word. Marriage requires a distinction. First of all, male and female, Jesus points that out. A leaving, father and mother. By the way, that doesn't only mean you're leaving their house, but you have to leave them personally also and put your spouse before them. Many a marriage has been rockier than it should have been because one or the other person puts mama and daddy before hubby or wifey. Not a good idea. And even more so, more commonly are marriages that put son and daughter before hubby or wifey. So, leaving and cleaving. Cleave to the wife. It requires unity. Oneness. The two become one flesh. Legal oneness, physical oneness, emotional oneness, spiritual oneness. Marriage is for life, finally. One man, one woman, for life, one exception. That's New Testament marriage principle. Very quickly for the last couple of minutes, one thing I didn't emphasize enough probably. The idea of committing adultery. He commits adultery. And I've pointed out before how some people say that adultery is when you break the marriage vow. So that's something that you do, and then you don't, it's over, and then the way to repent of that is to say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it, I wish I hadn't done it. The end. Goodbye. I'm happy now with my new wife. But adultery is committed by being with that other person. That's the significance of Matthew 19:9. If a man divorces his wife for any reason except for that woman being unfaithful, sexually unfaithful to him, and then he marries another woman, he's committing adultery by being with that woman. He's not committing adultery by having gotten married to that woman. He didn't commit adultery by getting married to her that one time. He's committing adultery by being with her. And therefore, if the sin of adultery is being with that person, then the only way to repent of that sin is to stop being with that person. This is the part that makes Matthew 19:9 so controversial, because people don't want to accept that. But it's no different than any other teaching of Scripture. it has to be accepted. If we want our marriage to be God approved, it has to be based on God's principles for marriage. So the most important decision a person will ever make in their life is to obey God by becoming a Christian and living faithfully. The second most important decision is arguably if you are going to get married and whom you will marry. And this is why we need to be teaching the young people in our lives how important marriage is. Most of us in here may be married or have been married or don't ever plan to get married again, maybe, or ever. And our children may be married. We may have grandchildren that are married. But I bet there's some young person in our life that we can help to understand the seriousness of marriage. Because they're not going to get it at school. They're not going to get it from TV. They're not going to get it from anywhere. Unless they get it from us. Marriage is important. And it is based on what Jesus says here, it is very, very serious. And it can affect our eternal situation.